Okay, we are going to make a start. I will start with our introduction. So this is a project called Global Plant Kitchens for anyone that is not familiar with that. This is a new project by London-based food education charity Made in Hackney. So we are a plant-based community cookery school. We've been running for over 10 years, and we've put together this project to educate and inspire people to eat more plants, to sort of make more healthy and sustainable choices, and to create sort of joyful connections with their community. You can see a little bit on this slide about what we do. So we make sure that everything that we do is plant-based or vegan. We use the terms interchangeably. We try and make everything as affordable and nutritious and delicious as possible. And we like to bring people together. So in our own space, in our own kitchen, but we also provide meals, sort of service of meals delivered out to people in the community, and other sort of partnership and collaboration work across London and beyond. So this evening's session is looking at plant-based nutrition. So the aim of this is to try and inspire anyone who wants to run any form of community kitchen or community cookery project. But we also know that some people that are watching might be interested in just finding out a little bit more about that. But we hope that with any of the information that you do have, you are inspired to sort of make more community-focused choices and go on that journey with others around you. So I'm going to hand over to our guest for today's session, which is Hannah Walker. Hannah is a certified plant-based dietitian, and she is a teacher at Made in Hackney and does lots of other amazing food-based things. So she's going to run through a really great presentation, which will hopefully answer a lot of the questions people have had about plant-based nutrition. So Hannah, I'm just going to disappear from the screen and you can take it away.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining this presentation. It's great to know that there's a lot of interest in this topic. So yeah, just to give you a bit of an overview about what we're going to cover. First, we're going to look at the Plant-Based Eat Well guide, which is basically a guide to looking at how you get a balanced plant-based meal. And then we're going to kind of just look over some of the wonderful advantages of following a whole foods plant-based diet. And I'll talk about what I mean by whole foods plant-based. And then the big question that a lot of people have is around plant-based proteins and how they're going to get enough protein. So we'll go over some of that and look at different levels of proteins in some different foods. And then I'll address some of the kind of key nutrients that are maybe of concern for people who are following plant-based diets. So things they need to be careful to make sure they're having enough of. And then we'll look quickly at nutrient supplementation and if and when it's appropriate. And then we'll have a bit of time to talk about some practical cooking tips and meal ideas and how to make sure those meals are balanced and following that sort of Eat Well guide model. And then I'll just direct you to a few resources. Okay, next slide. So this is a picture of the Plant-Based Eat Well guide that was developed by the Plant-Based Healthcare Professionals Network. And it's basically dividing kind of food into 5 main groups and looking at the balance that we should have of each of them. So we should be looking at having roughly 1/3 of our food should come from fruits and vegetables and salads. So ideally kind of fresh produce. In fact, it doesn't have to be fresh, frozen, but from that sort of those plant group categories. So fruits, vegetables, salads. And so that's a big bulk of a lot of our meals. And then about another 1/3 should come from your sort of starchy carbohydrates. So that's grains like pasta and rice and bread and potatoes. And that's providing a lot of the energy that we get. So carbohydrates gives us a lot of energy. It keeps us feeling full. And we're aiming really to be having whole grain sources ideally rather than white sources. So instead of having white rice, try to aim for brown rice, and similar with pastas, and a big part of what I talk about is diversity. So, trying to mix it up rather than having brown rice every day or pasta every day or bread every day, mixing up the sources of your carbohydrates. And then there's a slightly smaller section, the one in pink, which is for your plant-based proteins. And that includes things like beans and pulses and nuts and seeds. And we'll come on to more examples of that in one of the following slides. And then the blue section is for your dairy alternatives. So in the conventional Eat Well guide, that's your dairy section. So this is the dairy alternative section, which could be plant-based milks, plant-based yogurts, plant-based creams, and other sources that are rich in calcium. Basically, that's where we're trying to get a lot of calcium. And ideally, this should be fortified dairy. So at Made in Hackney, we generally promote using organic produce, but the plant-based dairy alternative category is one area where I say opt for the fortified versions, which won't be organic, because all the organic versions, or most of them, they're not fortified, and that often is one of the key sources of things like vitamin B12 and calcium and vitamin D when you're on a plant-based diet. And then we've got a tiny section. The purple section is for your oils and fats, and these should ideally be unsaturated fats, which they will be largely because most saturated fats are animal-based. Coconut oil is one of the few plant-based fat sources that is saturated, and it's fine to have in small quantities, but ideally we want to be promoting unsaturated fats, which are the healthier type of fat. So that's things like olive oil, rapeseed oil, avocados, and other vegetable oils. And then there are some things around the outside. So it's, as with any diet, it's really important that you're having enough water. So here it says sort of 6 to 8 glasses, but again, that depends on the person and their size and build and their activity levels. And then there's a section for kind of processed products and kind of sweet foods, where it's out of the circle because it's not essential. It's obviously fine to have occasionally, but we're not focusing on the main part of the diet on those foods. Okay, next slide. So some of the advantages of a whole foods plant-based diet. Firstly, just to talk about what do I mean by a whole foods plant-based diet. So technically, I could be having crisps and chips and Oreo biscuits and vegan burgers and vegan sausages, and be following a vegan diet or a plant-based diet, but they're quite heavily processed, those foods, and often they've got a lot of salt and sugar and processed fats added to them, and they tend to be lower in things like fiber. So when we say whole foods plant-based, we're talking about products in as minimally processed as possible, so things like vegetables and fruit and grains that have been minimally processed. So like your rice and your pasta is fine, potatoes are fine. And then in terms of protein sources, it's things like beans and lentils, tofu and tempeh. Whilst there is a certain degree of processing in them, we still count those as whole foods. And it tends to be when there's, it's a single ingredient thing. So tofu is just soy. It's been processed into a certain form, but it's soya. And tempeh, likewise, it's a fermented form of soya. So it's when you get things like vegan burgers that have got lots of oils and salt and sugar, and have been processed several different ways to create this other form. We don't classify that as being whole foods plant-based. So anyway, the advantages of a whole foods plant-based diet include increased fiber and antioxidant intake. So fiber is really important for our digestion, and antioxidants are really important for keeping us healthy, keeping our immune system healthy, and then increased energy levels, which a lot of people don't realize, but they find when they start a plant-based diet, they've got a lot more energy, partly because your body is using less energy to digest your food. So plant-based foods tend to be more easily digested, and really rich in nutrients that help with metabolism and digestion in general. And then improve mood and reduce risk of depression, which is can be controversial. So, you know, the evidence isn't super strong, but that really has a lot to do with your gut microbiome, which is a huge topic in itself, which I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I definitely incorporate that into, you know, all my advice around plant-based diets. And why I think it's so wonderful is because when we have a diverse range of plants, we're feeding the friendly bacteria in our gut. And most of the serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter associated with mood and happiness, most of that is produced in our gut. So when our gut is happy from having all of these plant foods, our mood tends to improve and it lowers the risk of mental health conditions such as depression. And it's not saying that if you're vegan, you're suddenly not going to have any issues with mental health and mood, but it certainly can help. And then improve weight management, which is quite a commonly known and cited one, largely because you're reducing the intake of foods that are high in saturated fat, and prioritizing more plants that tend to be lower in calories. And sort of associated with this is reduced risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. And then also the potential to reverse cardiovascular disease or heart disease and type 2 diabetes, as well as high blood pressure, high cholesterol and obesity. And a lot of this is actually linked to the increased fiber in the diet and the reduced intake of saturated fat. And the fact that you're getting all of these incredible antioxidants from plants. And there are some really impressive studies showing about reversing diabetes on plant-based diets. And then that kind of follows on from this increased longevity. There's a study called the Blue Zone study. I'm not sure if people have heard of it, but it's looking at 5 areas of the world where they've identified that people live a really long time. There's lots of people over 100. And a similarity across the board in their diets is that it's about 95% plant-based. Not to say they don't have any meat, they have small amounts of fish in some of them and sometimes small amounts of meat, but it's predominantly plant-based and minimally processed. So yeah, all the more reasons to eat more plants. Okay, next slide. Okay, so plant-based protein, the big one that it's the classic question that people say when you say I'm vegan or I'm going vegan. It's like, well, where are you going to get your protein from? And for a start, there's actually, most people are getting too much protein. And there's a real obsession with protein in a lot of society. But there are plenty of sources of plant-based protein. And what's really important is about having a diversity. Because protein is made up of something called amino acids. They're the little building blocks. And a lot of animal sources of protein have all of the amino acids contained within the meat or the fish. And there are some plant-based proteins like that, like quinoa is an example. But then others, they have most of the amino acids, but not all of them. And the simple way around that is just by making sure you're having different types of plant-based protein. So, for example, a classic example is having rice and beans, because rice, would you believe, does contain protein, and obviously so do beans and other lentils and pulses. And when you have them together, you're getting the full complement of amino acids, so all the proteins. And it's best that you're having protein little and often. If you have one meal with loads and loads of protein, for example, if someone was to go and have a giant steak, their body's not actually going to be able to absorb all of that. So in a way, plant-based protein sources are often better because it's slightly lower than animal sources in terms of the quantity of protein, but it's easier to eat more of it often. And it's lower in calories in general. So chickpeas has 15 grams of protein, and this is per cup. The things with the star is per cup cooked. So a cup of chickpeas has 15 grams. We've got edamame, which is the kind of fresh soybean, which is 17 grams, which is pretty high. Lentils, 18 grams. Quinoa is 8, but as I said, that's a complete protein in itself. And often we think of quinoa as our grain, and then we might also have, beans or pulses or tofu or something with that. So it's a good way of boosting your protein intake, is having quinoa as your grain. And there are other high protein grains, like things like buckwheat is pretty high, and millet is a good source as well. So having a good variety of different types of grains is good. And then we've got tofu, which is 20 grams. So tofu and tempeh are some of the highest forms of plant-based protein. And they can often kind of visually, or they can feel a bit more like you're replacing like a steak with a block of marinated tofu or something, for example. So people kind of get that in their heads and quite like that often. And then we've got lots of types of seeds, so chia seeds, hemp seeds, but all the other seeds like like pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, sesame seeds. They're all good sources of protein. And then as our nut butters and nuts in general. So I often recommend having nut butter based dressings for salads, and putting seeds on your salads. In fact, I also do a dressing made with tofu, like a silken tofu. And then seitan, which is a form of it's a type of wheat gluten. It's made from pure wheat gluten. And this isn't something I use quite so much because it is slightly more processed, but it is quite a pure source of a lot of protein. So it's only got one ingredient, hence it's not like a hyper processed food. And people like that a lot for kind of meat replacement products. Okay, so there are certain things that we need to consider on plant-based diets, which, often people say these are the disadvantages of plant-based diets because it's hard to get certain nutrients. And actually, it's not that hard when you're having a diverse plant-based whole foods diet, but you do need to just think about it, because it can be quite easy for people to fall into patterns of having pasta with tomato sauce and maybe stir-fry rice and not thinking enough about the certain foods that are really good to include more regularly. So iron is something that often people think is really hard to get on a plant-based diet, and I will explain to you how you can improve your iron absorption and good sources of it in the next slide. But iron is really important for making our red blood cells and carrying oxygen around our body. So some of the symptoms of iron deficiency include kind of fatigue and lethargy, and low energy levels. And then calcium, which people typically think about getting through things like milk and yogurts, and other forms of dairy, is important for building strong bones and teeth, but it's also got an important role in regulating heartbeat, and supporting the kind of your blood clotting and wound healing. We've got iodine, which helps make our thyroid hormones, which are involved in healthy metabolism and how your cells are functioning. And then vitamin B12, which is the big one that comes up a lot. And that helps make our red blood cells and our DNA. It's important in metabolism, and it's important in kind of brain function and development. And it's got lots of important roles. And then omega-3, which is sometimes forgotten about. And often we think omega-3 we can only get from fish and oily fish, but there are other sources, and so we'll discuss those. But that's really important for kind of healthy brain functioning and reducing the risk of kind of chronic inflammation. Okay, and there's just a point about vitamin D as well. I haven't put vitamin D on there, but vitamin D is certainly something we all need to consider. But vitamin D deficiency is a concern in people who are eating meat as well. And I can address that at the end if we've got time in questions. But often products that are fortified with calcium are also fortified with vitamin D. So that's why I suggested with those dairy alternatives opting for the fortified ones, because they'll be fortified with vitamin D usually. So here I've just got a table which might be useful for you to kind of study and keep, just listing those key nutrients and some food sources of them. And then I've put a few notes. So with iron, as I mentioned, things like lentils, beans and pulses, nuts and seeds, especially the dark leafy green vegetables, so things like kale and broccoli and rocket and cabbages. They're all really good sources of iron. And then on the sweeter side, things like dried fruit and molasses. So molasses is really rich in iron. So if you are going to do kind of in your classes, if you want to do desserts, then it's really good to think about using sugars, alternative sugars. So things like molasses, and using dried fruit as your sweetener. So there's some examples there. There are many other foods as well. But a key thing to note with iron is that iron from plant-based sources is less readily absorbed than iron from animal-based sources. But there are ways that you can enhance the absorption. So one of the key things is to pair your plant-based sources of iron with vitamin C rich foods. So that's things like citrus and tomatoes and red peppers, and actually lots of vegetables, including those dark green leafy vegetables. They themselves, they have iron and vitamin C. So that's why it's really good to have lots of dark green leafy vegetables. And same with the dried fruit, it's high in vitamin C and iron. But there's some really classic examples that can help with this. So for example, often we have a salad and it has a dressing on. And if you've got citrus in that dressing, then you're going to enhance the absorption of the iron that might be in the kale or the spinach. Or you might have some beans, like a bean salad with some red peppers in there or some tomatoes in there. A classic one is something like a lentil bolognese, which is a nice sort of alternative to a meat-based bolognese. And you've got the tomato sauce that's going to have vitamin C. A kind of little note on that is when you cook vitamin C rich foods, it does reduce the vitamin C. So if you can add some fresh tomatoes at the end or a squeeze of lemon juice at the end, then that will make sure that vitamin C level is still high. And another note on the iron is the fact that there are other foods that will inhibit the absorption of iron. So it gets a little bit complicated, but this is just to, I know we've had some questions about this, so just to really try and optimize that iron intake. So drinking tea or coffee with meals is not a good idea because, it's herbal teas are fine, but kind of regular tea and coffee, they have something called tannins in them, and that blocks the absorption of iron. And this even applies to decaf coffee because it's not the caffeine that's blocking the absorption, it's the tannins. So herbal teas don't have tannins generally, they're low in tannins, but it's kind of regular tea and coffee do. So try and have, if you're having your coffee or your tea, try and have it at least an hour before and wait a couple of hours after before you have your tea or coffee. And that can be one of the things that tricks people out because they might have a coffee after their meal or they'll have a cup of tea before or after. So that's one thing. The other thing is dairy products will inhibit the absorption of iron, but if you are following a plant-based diet, that shouldn't be an issue. So they're the two main inhibitors. There are a few others, but I won't bog you down with that unless people are desperate to know at the end. So calcium-rich foods. So tofu is a really good example, actually, of a food as opposed to one of the plant-based dairy alternatives, and specifically calcium-set tofu, which most tofu is. That's a really good source of calcium. And then you've got your plant-based milks and yogurts and other dairy alternatives. Just check the label. Most of them are fortified, but obviously the organic ones, as I mentioned, won't be. And then there's foods like tahini, which is a sesame seed paste, almonds, figs, and certain other dried fruits. And then again, your dark green leafy veg. So there's a little bit of a pattern here that dark green leafy veg are really, really good. Yeah, I've just put a note about, organic plant-based milks won't be fortified. And then iodine is a tricky one. There aren't many sources of iodine. Iodine is usually something that's fortified in dairy products. So it's not necessarily naturally occurring in dairy products, but they often, it's fortified to the animal feeds. Seaweeds are a really good source of iodine, and seaweeds are a really incredible superfood, in fact, if you have access to them, and they're becoming more and more accessible. The only concern is that the amounts can vary a lot in seaweeds. They can't measure it very easily. And so there is a risk that if you're having loads of seaweeds, then you'll overdose because the levels in seaweed can be really, really high, especially in some things like kelp or kombu. But I think it's a great idea to consider adding some seaweed to your diet if you have access to it. And I live near the beach, so I'm actually having a kelp lasagna tonight with some friends. So that's something to consider and maybe to look into as an addition to your plant-based diets. And then B12. So whilst it doesn't occur naturally in many plant-based products, there is some evidence that there is some in seaweed and certain mushrooms and wild mushrooms. We can get good amounts of B12 from fortified foods. So this will include plant-based milks and dairy products, breakfast cereals, and things like nutritional yeast. But you need to be aiming to have at least 2 or 3 servings a day. and aiming for at least 3 micrograms through your food sources. But generally, it's often recommended that people supplement with B12. It's one of the most commonly accepted supplements or recommended supplements for people on a plant-based diet. And so I put 2 options of whether you do it weekly or daily as to the sort of some of the recommended amounts. And they're very easy to get quite cheaply. So that can be a good kind of backup. And just a note about B12, if, for example, you start a plant-based diet, you go and get your bloods checked after a couple of months, your B12 is likely to be absolutely fine. It tends to take 5 years before deficiency shows up. So your B12 could be depleting gradually, and you'll only get symptoms after 5 years of being deficient. So yeah, so it's just worth kind of making sure you're trying to have enough, whether you're feeling like you've got symptoms or not. And then omega-3, we've got lots of the seeds and nuts, so flax seeds and walnuts, pumpkin seeds, chia seeds, and rapeseed oil are all really good sources. But they are a source of something called ALA, which is a type of omega-3. And this needs converting to the other forms, which are called EPA and DHA, which are the ones found in oily fish. And the rate of that conversion isn't always that efficient. So and it's hard to know without getting a test, and it's not something that I've had tested myself, but some people do choose to get a microalgae supplement, especially if they've got issues like heart disease, where omega-3 is often recommended as a way of reducing inflammation. So if you're having enough of those foods, those chia seeds, those flax seeds, then there's a good chance you'll be okay without supplementation. But if there are concerns, then it's something you might want to consider. Okay. And then I've just put a slide on here just to think there are certain population groups where their needs are higher than average. So children, the elderly, and athletes. There are also other groups, such as pregnant women, and if you are recovering from surgery, or if you've got certain disease states, but these are some of the common ones. So, for example, with the elderly, they have an increased need for protein to try and slow down muscle loss, which occurs naturally with age. Infants and children and pregnant women need to make sure they're having enough protein, calcium, and omega-3. So for growth and brain development and nervous system development. And then athletes, they have an overall increased need for calories and protein. And often plant-based diets are lower in calories, especially than meat containing diets. So it's often that athletes just need to eat large volumes. And I'm speaking from the point of view of a former and kind of still long distance runner, and the amounts that I need to eat just to kind of, well, certainly when I was training, just to sort of maintain my already very low body weight, it's it can be quite hard. So yeah. Okay. So here's just a little note on supplementation. Again, you can follow a plant-based diet and not supplement and be fine. But you have to be really careful, and you have to kind of really get your head around all of those nutrient groups that you need to watch out for. So some people do like to take supplements, and there's generally, I would say, if you're going to start to take an individual supplement like iron or something, you should get your blood levels checked before just starting to take iron, because you can overdose. So yeah, get your blood levels checked if you have any symptoms, especially. A lot of people choose to supplement with B12 without getting their bloods checked, because, as I said, you'll probably get your bloods checked and your levels will be fine initially. There's a supplement, I've put a few recommendations, there are lots out there. There's one called Veg1, which is recommended by the Vegan Society. They've helped develop it, and it provides vitamin B12, vitamin D, iodine, and selenium. And it's not too expensive for a 6-month supply. It's £12.70, and it's shipped internationally. And then I've put a vitamin B12 supplement on there as an example, and this is one I quite like because it's a liquid form and you spray it onto your tongue, and that's one way that can be better absorbed. Stop myself from sneezing. Yeah. Okay, so practical cooking tips. I've got a few kind of big messages. So eat the rainbow. So try and have at least 3 different colours of vegetables or fruit per meal, and choose seasonal if possible. And the reason for this is that different colours indicate different nutrients. So if you're eating a range of colours, you don't need to know whether it contains this polyphenol or that vitamin or that mineral. If you're having a range of colours, you're going to likely be getting a good mixture of different vitamins and minerals. And this comes down to the diversity thing as well, which is really good for our gut health. And also, I haven't got a slide on it, but like I mentioned about a big range of different types of grains. So rather than just having pasta and rice and bread, having buckwheat and quinoa and millet and barley, and really trying to mix it up. Okay. And then aim for around 1/3 of the plate to be plant-based protein. And I know in the Eat Well guide, it sort of had it as a bit less than 1/3. I often simplify it by saying aim for 1/3 of vegetables or fruits, 1/3 of your whole grain or starchy carbohydrates, and 1/3 of your plant-based proteins. Just makes it a bit simpler because you're likely to add a dressing that might have some dairy alternative or some tahini, which gives you a calcium, or and then you're likely to be cooking with oil anyway. So it's almost like you don't need to think about having like a little slither of oil as part of your mix. You're naturally going to cook with that often. So yeah, and I've mentioned these already, but things like lentils, beans, pulses, soy products. And again, with that whole diversity thing, try and mix it up. So if you're making a chili, for example, put 2 or 3 different types of beans, or put some lentils and some beans. And maybe you will make a dressing that contains a nut butter or something. So, or you're pairing it with a grain that's going to be protein rich. So that's tip number 2. Tip number 3. So this one is something I certainly follow, which is aim to have something raw with each meal. And so that could be as simple as a salad or some fresh herbs that you sprinkle on, or something like ferments or pickles, or some crudités. And partly this is for sort of variation of taste and having something fresh and zingy, because I really think, it's really important that whatever we're eating should be tasty and interesting and have different flavor sensations. But also you're going to have preserved a lot of those heat soluble vitamins. So things like vitamin C and vitamin B, if they're exposed to heat, they reduce quite significantly. So by having raw, something a bit raw, you're going to maximize that freshness and that nutrition. And then I've also put that ideally some sort of bitter green. So that's things like watercress and rocket, and certain herbs like parsley is quite bitter, because that will stimulate your digestive juices. So your digestion will help you digest food better and more efficiently. So that's often something people don't realize, but it's a good reason to have a salad at the start of a meal. Okay. And then, as I mentioned already, this is just to reinforce that pair iron-rich foods with vitamin C-rich foods. And often these are quite natural pairings. So, for example, having tomatoes with lentils, or having a lemon-based dressing. So they can be quite easy to kind of add in. Okay, next one. Using lots of herbs and spices. And again, for me, the main reason I do this is because it makes food taste really nice. I love exploring cuisines from around the world and how they use different spices and herbs to add real kind of really interesting deep flavors and the real sort of signature of different foods from around the world. But they also have all these incredible nutritional benefits. So, for example, parsley is really rich in iron. So again, another iron-rich food that we don't think about often. Cinnamon, there's lots of evidence to show that it can help control and lower blood sugar levels. So another good reason to add some cinnamon to your apple crumble or to your porridge, any sweet foods. I just add cinnamon. I love cinnamon. And paprika and chili peppers can help boost metabolism. And they're just a few examples. A lot of herbs and spices are really rich in antioxidants. So again, for that immune support, they can help with digestion and all sorts. So add lots of flavor with herbs and spices. Okay, and now I've just got a section of ideas for different meals. And some of them, we can sort of go through them quite quickly. But just to give you some ideas about things for variety. So fresh fruit, but the thing is I've put, don't just have fresh fruit, have fresh fruit, some yogurt, So the fruit is our veg section, veg and fruit section. The yogurt is that can be a good source of protein. And then adding some toasted nuts or toasted oats for a bit of that carbohydrate from the oats, and then the nuts and seeds providing some healthy fats. So just trying to think again about roughly fitting things into that Eat Well guide. And then porridge, again, so we want to think porridge is our sort of starchy carbohydrate. And then pairing it with some plant-based milk to get that extra, fortified calcium, vitamin D and B12, and then topping it with fresh fruit. So we make sure we're trying to get lots of that third of the plate with fruit, and or dried fruit. Obviously, dried fruit, I've said, is really rich in iron and calcium, so that's a good thing to add. And then nuts or seeds on top for some healthy fats and extra protein. Porridge oats themselves are a good source of protein as well. Chia seed puddings, you might have seen, there's lots of recipes online you can find for them, and I always like to do wacky flavour combos like apple pie flavour, carrot cake flavour, cherry bakewell, and including different types of fruits and vegetables within them. And the same for porridge. I often do carrot cake porridge, which is basically just got grated carrots and cinnamon and walnuts. And then there's some good things that you can have on toast, so scrambled tofu instead of scrambled egg, stir-fried mushrooms, pea or broad bean guacamole, and that's because we don't really grow avocados very well in this country, but we do grow peas and broad beans, so that's that seasonalness, and peas and broad beans are higher in protein than avocados as well. And then having these on some whole grain or sourdough toast, and then topping it with some more herbs and maybe some tomatoes or sun-dried tomatoes. And then smoothies are a really good way of getting a lot of nutrition in often quite a small volume. So as well as having your kind of fruits and veg in your smoothies, adding things like nut butters and seeds or other nuts, and then some coconut milk or coconut yogurt to add some more protein, as well as those fortified sources of calcium and B12 and vitamin D. So yeah. Then lunch, a Buddha bowl is a really good example of how you can literally just plate up your Eat Well plate. So you can have your third of your grains, your third with different veggies, and then your third with your beans or lentils or pulses or stir-fried tofu or something. And then I always, try and add some dressing and herbs to help with that absorption of those nutrients and helping with things like digestion. Then hearty soups are a nice quick lunch idea. I've put some examples there. And again, with your soup, to make sure you're having the balance, try and include some sort of protein. So often, soups are thickened really nicely with lentils or beans. And then, serve it, either have it, with some sweet potato in the soup or potato to add some starchy carbohydrates to help you give you a bit more energy, or have it with some sourdough bread or something on the side. But miso noodle soup is another soup option with some grilled tofu and some green veg and or mushrooms. Sandwiches and wraps, you could have hummus-based wraps with some salad or grated carrot. Refried beans and sweet corn and peppers is one I quite like doing. And then you can do a sort of mock on a bacon, lettuce and tomato sandwich, but using tempeh. And then pasta salads. And again, if you're having a pasta salad, make sure there's some sort of protein in there. You will get some protein from the pasta itself. But, add in some, cubed tofu or some stir-fried tempeh or some beans and lentils, or have it with a dressing that's got some protein in. So either like a peanut butter based dressing or tahini based dressing, or having it with lots of seeds and nuts within the salad. And then something that's a really nice, quick, transportable lunch is that I do a lot is chickpea veggie frittata muffins. So using chickpea flour, which is a really good source of protein, actually. You can get it a lot in a lot of supermarkets. They use it a lot in Indian cooking, I know. It's often called gram flour or besan flour. Really, really high in protein, and you can use that instead of eggs to make a frittata. It's really simple. You'll find lots of recipes online, and you can use chickpea flour for all sorts of other things. I often use it to thicken soups. You can use it to make a plant-based mayo. So that's an ingredient that you might want to explore. Okay. Then some evening meal ideas, which arguably can be similar to some of the lunch ones. But I love to do lots of curries and dals, and that's a really easy way to get lots of veggies in, as well as lots of plant proteins from your lentils and chickpeas and things. And And then it's quite a fun thing. I've done it in classes quite a lot, where we make homemade chapatis or homemade naan breads, or even paratha, where you stuff it with some extra veggies. And yeah, often I find doing curries in classes is great, because you can have people making some chutneys, which is your fresh ingredients, chutneys or salads. You can have people doing the curry itself and doing all the veg prep for that. And then you can let everyone have a go at making their own chapati or naan bread. So that's a really nice one. Hearty stews. So Moroccan tagines with chickpeas and vegetables, Mexican black beans with brown rice, vegan bean chili and jacket potato, ratatouille with some nice crusty bread. And if I was going to do a ratatouille, that's an example of somewhere where it's not traditional in the recipe, but I would add some beans in just to make sure I'm getting enough protein, because the vegetables in ratatouille are delicious and full of nutrients, but they're relatively low in protein. So I would add some white beans or some butter beans to that, or I'd have a side of a lentil salad or something. And then lots of pasta dishes. So you've got pesto pasta. Again, I often try and add some beans in there. Broccoli and mushrooms are two examples of quite high protein veg. So that's another tip for getting some extra protein, is opting for some higher protein veg. Vegan lasagna, like I'm having this evening. Spaghetti, you can make vegan veggie meatballs, which is another thing that's quite fun in classes, especially with kids. And then things like mushroom stroganoff, all things you can, some of these recipes are traditionally meat-based or they have dairy in them, but there's so many plant-based alternatives that it's quite easy to make those vegan. And then risottos is a really lovely kind of comfort food, and there's loads of, I like to be quite creative with my risottos, so kind of doing curried butternut squash and lentil risotto, courgette and broad bean with pesto. And then veggie pizzas are a real favorite in classes as well, because everyone can kind of customize their pizza with the veg they like. And then I tend to do either a tahini or a cashew based kind of sauce or parmesan to get a bit of extra protein. Okay, so I've just about got through that without going over too much. I've got some resources here just in terms of the nutrition side of things. If you want to look into those nutrients a bit more, the Vegan Society and plant-based healthcare professionals have some really good resources and pages, information pages. Nutrition Facts is a good website for kind of research papers on the kind of latest developments around nutrition. And then for recipes, of course, I'm going to recommend the Made in Hackney website. We've got a range of recipes that are super healthy, super delicious, and yeah, really creative. So, and there's loads and loads of other vegan blogs and things online as well. But, obviously I'm going to promote Made in Hackney because I love all the stuff that they come out with. And I think there are some of my recipes on there as well.
Wow, amazing. Thank you, Hannah.
Going through a lot of information. So yeah, please
go ahead with
some questions.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely fantastic. I learned a lot. I learned firstly that I really want to eat that kelp lasagna. Really. Did you forage the kelp?
Yes, so I lead foraging courses as well. So had a nice wade in the sea last weekend and dried it, and now we'll just rehydrate it. Well, I say my friends are making it, which is amazing. My foraging friends down the road.
Sounds lush. We have about 10 to 15 minutes left. We've had some questions in. And I know some of this you might have sort of alluded to or covered in some respect, but if we sort of answer them in the context of the question. So the first thing is about how would you plan recipes for plant-based cookery classes? So thinking about cost and then thinking about how to get that nutritional balance.
Yeah, so as I said, I think about that rough guide of like a third from carbohydrates, a third from veggies, and a third from your plant-based protein. And cost-wise, I just love using lentils and beans because they're super cheap. And you can get them in tins, or you can do it even cheaper if you buy them dried and soak them and cook them. Often in classes, there's not that much time to soak your beans and to cook them, but it's something I often talk people through doing at home. It's really simple if you can plan, but tins are really, really cheap. And then I will tend to use as many vegetables that are seasonal as possible. I try and just use seasonal veg because it will tend to be cheaper when it's in season. But I also say to people it's fine to use frozen veg. especially at times of year when there's not as much fresh produce. Frozen peas are a real kind of staple that's good to have in your freezer. And they're really cheap, and they're a good source of protein, as well as getting that veggie fat, those nutrients from the veg. So yeah, think about seasonal veg, beans and pulses, because they're a cheap source of plant-based protein. And then again, grains are pretty cheap in general. You can buy them in bulk. So yeah, buying in bulk is good as well. And then herbs and spices, especially spices, are probably the cheapest, most nutrient dense food you can buy. It's not much to buy a little jar of spice, and it's really packs a good flavor punch and a nutrition punch.
Absolutely, that's fantastic advice. And as Hannah said, if anyone is looking for great recipes, either from a teaching point of view or for a general use point of view, then the Made in Hackney website has a lot of information. And specifically the Global Plant Kitchens website, which this event is part of. We have a whole section in there on how to plan for your classes, and we will be doing a specific event on that. Before I ask the next question, I'll invite anyone who's tuning in live to ask any questions they have for Hannah on nutrition. You can just pop that in the chat box. But we've had a question from one of the kitchens on the programme that's in Peru. So they use a lot of soy protein that they get. It's 100%, well, it's non-GMO soy. And their question is really about wanting to make sure that the nutrition is optimal, and that they're wanting to sort of get the best provision of protein. So I suppose, is it that they can provide like for like, or again, would you be recommending anything in particular that they could do with that?
So yeah, I mean, you're lucky in that you've got a good access to non-GMO soy, and it's very abundant where you are. First, it's great to have you join from all the way in Peru. That's really exciting for me. And I think the soy you're talking about is kind of pure soya, so it's 100% soya. There are lots of soya-based products that have lots of sugar and salt and are quite processed. So we try to minimize that at Made in Hackney. But the sort of soya chunks that you can get are a really good source of protein. They're high in protein, and that you can be quite creative and versatile with how you use them. The one thing I would say is to try and also mix in, using some beans and lentils or other sources of protein, just to make sure you're getting a big enough range of the different amino acids. So not overly relying on just using those soy products. But it's a really good source of protein, soya in general, especially if that it's non-GMO. And yeah, and as long as that's part of a balanced meal with plenty of veggies in there as well, then that's a really good option. So yeah, just mix it up a bit sometimes as well.
Fab, thank you. And so yeah, another question is really about sort of what would you say people's first steps could be? Like there's so much information you've provided, and for people that maybe aren't as familiar with cooking from scratch or as familiar with lots of different ingredients, how would they sort of take these steps towards making sure they've got a balanced plant-based meal, either if they're cooking it for others or for themselves?
I really recommend finding a few one-pot dishes that you like, where you can have your ingredients and you can think, right, I've got this pile of veg, I've got these tins of beans, and I'm gonna add in this grain, or serve it with this grain. And so it's cooking all in one pot. You can add your spices and herbs to that one pot, so it simplifies the cooking process. You don't have multiple pans on the go at the same time. You can often make a really cheap, quite easy meal, with a tin of tomatoes, a tin of beans, and some mushrooms and some spinach or something, and then your herbs and spices, and go for flavors and the types of dishes that you're familiar with already. If you've just transitioned, so say it's a bolognese, just try doing a lentil bolognese, or if you like having soups, just pack it full of veggies, and instead of using chicken, you could try using something like chickpeas or even something like jackfruit. So think about the foods you like, and then there will always be a vegan equivalent or alternative. I also recommend looking to kind of countries around the world where they naturally eat a lot of vegan plant-based foods. So like India, I love doing dals and curries, and they're quite easy one-pot dishes to do, and then gradually just build up your repertoire and yeah, build up your confidence.
Yeah, that is great advice. Everyone has to start somewhere. So we have no more questions lined up. So if anyone wants to get one in there, please do take advantage of this time with Hannah to ask a question. But if not, if anyone does put one in, I will ask it. But I'll just invite Hannah to, is there any sort of final thoughts, any random tips of wisdom that you would like to finish on today?
I think, I mean, I guess this is from a kind of class point of view. If you're running a class, like I sort of mentioned about that whole thinking about the different elements that you want to include in a meal. So how do we optimize each of those elements? So the grain, do we want to stir through some herbs into the grain that we're using, say adding like some coriander or parsley to the rice? And then the veggies, do we want to add different spices to them? Do we want to have like a little salsa or a chutney or a dressing? So just to keep things exciting in classes where there's different elements. And yeah, you know, choosing, if you're teaching a class, maybe choosing a grain that people might not use so much at home, but that's easy to access. So maybe using pearl barley instead of using rice. It's very, very cheap. And it's got a really nice texture, and yeah, it's got some different nutritional properties that are really great. It's a bit low in carbohydrates if that's something that people are concerned about. And yeah, so kind of think about the different elements and being a bit creative. What other things was I going to mention? And then tips for people at home. Often in classes, people say, I wish I could cook like this at home more, or wish I had more time. I always say bulk cook, do bulk cooking at the weekend. So when you have got time, just go for it and cook a big tray and then freeze it, or you know, it will keep, because it doesn't contain meat and dairy, it lasts a lot longer than it would otherwise in the fridge. And then I you know, when I worked full-time in the NHS, every Sunday I would cook a big, either like a curry or a stew, or and then I would do a big tray of roasted veg, and then I would make up a big batch of couscous or something, and I might add some different salad or something each day to make a bit of variety, or some days add pesto and some days add something else. But it meant I didn't really have to think about lunch too much, because I had enough diversity within what I'd cooked. I'd put 5 different vegetables in the curry, and you know, I'd added herbs, so even if I had the same thing for lunch every day, it was interesting because I had lots going on, and then I had something different every evening for dinner. So
that is stellar advice there from an expert. So the next questions I can answer. So someone has asked, can people come and join one of our classes in the future? If you are based in London, then we have a programme of classes. We have both community focused classes, and then we have master classes as well, which are more in-depth, paid for classes that go deep into different topics and techniques. If you go on the Made in Hackney website, madeinhackney.org, I'll pop it in the chat, you can find out about our classes, and you can also find out about our online classes. So if you're not in London, you can join us online. We either have live classes, and then we have recordings. So like this session, we'll share the recording. So we try and make it as accessible for people sort of as far and wide as possible, which was one thing that came out of the lockdown time. And then the other question we had was about, will we have any sort of in-person events or conferences in 2023? So this program, Global Plant Kitchens, is a global international program. So we're doing all of our events online like this, so that we can be suitable for people from all different time zones and regions. And then we can also provide the recording of events after. So we have many more events scheduled for 2023, and they're all on the globalplantkitchens.org website. But they are all online. So hopefully you can have a look at those and join us at them. And I will just quickly pull up a slide that has the next ones on it. Here we go. Just back to Hannah's. So here we have the next the next 4 events. So September, we're doing social media marketing. And then in October, we're really looking at running classes. So if you are wanting to run community food classes, that is the event for you. And then in November and December, we're looking at impact and evaluation and funding. Again, like I said at the start, this is a specific program to support people that are setting up community kitchens. So that's sort of how those are focused. But yeah, we're kind of drawing to a close there. I'm just going to quickly put globalplantkitchens.org into the chat. If you're not part of that program, it is free. All the resources on there, loads of really good templates, information, examples that you can access. All you need to do is register, create a little login, and then you have access to all of that information and anything else that we decide to add to that program. So I'm going to just wrap up now and just say thank you from myself and the team in the project, and just a massive thank you to Hannah, and let you sort of say goodbye as well.
Thank you so much for attending, everyone. Hope it's been useful.
Thank you so much. And yeah, goodbye everyone, and yeah, hopefully we'll see you at another event soon.